So, good morning and welcome to this NUPI interview on the protests in Hong Kong. My name is Bjørnar Sverdrup-Thygeson, a researcher, and I am standing here with Marc Lanteigne, a senior researcher on China and East Asia. And first of all, these protests have been grabbing headlines worldwide. What causes the current demonstrations in Hong Kong, and who are the protesters?
Okay, the demonstrations that we've seen in Hong Kong over the past few weeks have been a direct result over very serious debates within Hong Kong over the concept of universal suffrage. In June of this year, there was a white paper released by the Chinese government which further outlined the concept of one country, two systems, which has been the guiding policy of Hong Kong since the handover of the city to China in 1997 from Great Britain. The other major cause has been the issue of universal suffrage itself. There was an announcement made by the Chinese government at the end of August of this year that universal suffrage, in other words, one person, one vote, would be enacted in Hong Kong for the first time. But, and this is a major caveat, that the candidates would need to be vetted by a committee, electoral committee that would be primarily guided towards China, that would be overseen by Beijing. This was seen by some protesters, those who were against this idea, as a counter to the to the concept of universal suffrage. And making the situation more complicated was the fact that there was a referendum held in Hong Kong during June of this year, which asked, okay, how would you want the 2017 elections, the upcoming elections, undertaken? And even though the vote was not recognized by Beijing, overwhelmingly, there was support for the idea of complete universal suffrage. In other words, any candidate could stand, and one person, one vote. So the situation was getting very difficult since June. And then it was announced by a movement of legal specialists, as well as others who are pro-democracy figures in Hong Kong, that there would be protests, demonstrations in Hong Kong leading up to the National Day on October 1st. That was the plan. However, a bunch of student organizations who were also very frustrated with the proposed 2017 election plan began to develop their own demonstrations. They actually launched them about a week before the Golden Week. So these two sets of protests came together by the time we get to October 1st. So we see one movement, the so-called Occupy Central for Love and Peace, and then various student organizations which have come together to demonstrate.
But you point out that this is to a large degree a fight over who has the right to define the concept of one country, two systems.
Yes.
What is this one country, two systems, and how does that define the current relationship between mainland China and Hong Kong?
Okay, the concept dates back to the initial negotiations between the United Kingdom and China over the status of Hong Kong during the 1980s. Both sides were looking to find a solution to the status of Hong Kong after 1997. So one country, two systems was seen as a way of compromising. That Hong Kong would be reverted to Chinese sovereignty, but it would be allowed to retain a great deal of its indigenous, for example, legal system, its rights, its economy, its distinct economic structure, all of that would be retained. So one country, two systems. And this is not only important in terms of Hong Kong, but this is also seen as a potential solution to the Taiwan question. China is still seeking eventual unification with Taiwan. This was seen as an experiment, the Hong Kong one country, two systems, as a possible model for potential reunification with Taiwan. So this had very important ramifications.
So what specifically, these two somewhat emerging protest movements, what are their main demands?
Okay. The primary demands of the demonstrators, first of all, has been the reworking of the election law for 2017 to allow for what they call full universal suffrage, to allow any candidate to stand and to allow one person, one vote. This is seen as an unacceptable outcome as far as Beijing is concerned. The other major demand of the protesters is stepping down of the current chief executive, C.Y. Leung. Since the beginning of his tenure, he has been viewed by the protesters as being out of touch with the political situation in Hong Kong, as being too close to Beijing. The situation was made even more complicated when it was revealed a very short time ago that Mr. Leung had received consultancy payments from an Australian firm to the tune of about 50 million Hong Kong dollars. This was seen as very suspect, even though I'm not sure of the legal ramifications of this. The fact that this happened further strengthened the idea that Mr. Leung was out of touch with the Hong Kong mainstream. But even going further back, there has been a great deal of dissatisfaction between Hong Kong and the Chinese government, as well as Hong Kong and the mainland, for quite a few years now. You can go as far back as, for example, the SARS crisis in 2002-2003. There was a bit of friction between both sides over how that was handled. In 2003, there was an attempt to put forward a new security law, which would have greatly curtailed free speech, free expression in Hong Kong. So that was abandoned. And then in 2012, there was an attempt to renovate the educational system, to stress patriotic education. And that again was seen as unnecessary interference in Hong Kong education, so it too is abandoned. And then you have various social issues. There have been, for example, problems of discrimination, mainland tourists in Hong Kong. There have been also problems about the economic situation in Hong Kong, about how land prices are going up, rents are going up, and many young people in Hong Kong are very worried about jobs in their future.
So these demands obviously have deep roots.
Yes.
So what have briefly the responses been from Beijing and from the authorities in Hong Kong to these protests and to these demands?
Okay. The first night of the protests in Hong Kong, the police were very heavily criticized for the use of tear gas against unarmed demonstrators. And what happened afterwards is that protesters started taking to carrying around umbrellas, wearing masks, which is why this movement has been nicknamed the Umbrella Revolution. The umbrella has become kind of a symbol for the protesters. Since that time, though, the police have considerably backed off. There have been very few confrontations between protesters and police. And at least for the first few days of the protests, there were quite a few thousand people occupying various parts of the city, including financial districts and other major areas. Since that time, though, the numbers have started to fall off. Now, Beijing has looked at these demonstrations with a great deal of concern. Reporting on the demonstrations in Beijing has been very limited. And the primary concern that Beijing has expressed is that the protests are going to have a very negative effect on Hong Kong's future economic situation. It's going to affect tourism and its status as a financial hub. There have also been reports in some of the Chinese media, and some politicians in Beijing have also suggested this, that these protests are being guided to some degree behind the scenes by so-called foreign interests. Interpret that however which way you want. And there's also been some recent criticism in the Chinese press that the West is hoping this will turn into a so-called color revolution, similar to what happened in the former Soviet Union back about 10 years ago, and more recently the so-called Arab Spring protests. So there's kind of an attempt to equate all of this as so-called improper or immoral Western interference.
But, well, to continue further along that road, to what degree has there been any international interference in the Hong Kong protests? How has the international community responded to the events as we have seen them unfolding?
Responses by the international community have been quite muted so far. Both the United Kingdom, the United States, other European governments have expressed concern and certainly have expressed the idea that there should be some kind of a peaceful solution to this very complicated problem. But beyond that, there has been very much a hands-off approach by many Western governments, primarily out of concern that it is going to look to Beijing that the protests are being manipulated from outside. This has been a long-standing concern in Chinese policy circles for many, many decades. There's the concept of so-called peaceful evolution, the idea that the West is seeking to undermine China's authority from within. So this is something which the West has been very careful not to give the impression of.
So the potential long-term consequences of this, locally and internationally, what might they be?
Okay. Well, the situation as it stands now, the chief executive, Mr. Leung, has so far said that he is not going to step down. So far, the government in Beijing has given Mr. Leung their support. The protests have started to ease off. The numbers have started to fade. Over the past 2 days, police have come in and started to remove some of the barricades in certain parts of downtown. So how this is going to end is still very much a mystery. The demands of the primary protesters have remained, but there have been strong assertions, both by the chief executive and by Beijing, that the primary demand, the idea that universal suffrage will be implemented in Hong Kong, is simply not viable at this point. It's a complicated situation. Hong Kong has not had a democratic tradition. Even under the British government, Hong Kong was ruled by colonial governor. So there's no experience with direct democracy in Hong Kong right now. The other problem is that while the protesters do have a degree of support within the city, there is also a bit of a backlash forming. Those who do not support the protests, and those include shopkeepers, other businesses which have been very badly affected by the protests, the loss in revenue. Some have started to take into wearing blue ribbons to show that they don't support the Occupy movement and that they support the police's efforts to bring about order. So however this is going to end, and it's difficult to predict exactly what the end point of this has really demonstrated that within Hong Kong itself there are a lot of political divisions. And this really calls into question the usefulness so far of the one country, two systems model. So we have to wait and see.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.